I think there's something deeply wrong with our economic system if there is allowed to be private companies that are valued at that much, while there are so many people around the world that also live in such poverty. Like, there's just something deeply wrong about that degree of inequality that has been enabled in the system that we live in today. And especially, it feels deeply problematic that this has been allowed to happen for a company that has no effective business model.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von Handelsblatt Disrupt, dem Podcast über neue Ideen, Disruptionen und die Zukunft der digitalen Welt. Mein Name ist Larissa Holzki und ich begrüße Sie wie immer ganz herzlich aus unserem Podcast-Studio hier in Düsseldorf. Seit dieser Woche ist es offiziell. Der ChatGPT-Entwickler OpenAI wird von Investoren jetzt mit 500 Milliarden Dollar bewertet und ist damit das wertvollste Startup weltweit. Doch die Zahl allein kann nicht ausdrücken, wie mächtig das erst 10 Jahre alte Unternehmen seit der Veröffentlichung seines berühmten Chatbots ChatGPT geworden ist. Mit seiner Technologie und seinen Zukunftsvisionen bestimmt die Firma von Sam Altman die Agenten von Vorstandssitzungen bei Konzernen weltweit. Regierungschefs rund um den Globus lassen sich von dem CEO beraten, welche Risiken künstliche Intelligenz mit Blick auf Fake News, absichtlich herbeigeführte Pandemien und unsere Verteidigung darstellt. Und wenn Sie sich schon gefragt haben, wie lange es Ihren Job wohl noch gibt, dann könnte auch das etwas mit OpenAI zu tun haben. Eines liegt daher auf der Hand. Wer die rasante Dynamik im KI-Rennen verstehen will, der muss auch OpenAI verstehen. Und die Journalistin, der das bisher wohl am besten gelungen ist, habe ich heute zum Podcast eingeladen. Die Technologie-Reporterin Karen Hao hat seit den Anfangsjahren von OpenAI hunderte Interviews mit früheren und aktuellen Mitarbeitern der Firma geführt. Sie ist zu Menschen im globalen Süden gereist, die als Clickworker für die US-Firma KI trainieren und hat Einblick in eine Vielzahl von internen Dokumenten bekommen. Über all das hat sie kürzlich ein Buch geschrieben, in dem viel drinsteht, was Sam Altman gern geheim gehalten hätte. Im Podcast habe ich mit Karen Hao darüber gesprochen, wie OpenAI so einflussreich werden konnte, ob sie die enorme Bewertung jetzt für gerechtfertigt hält und wie sie als Kind einer chinesischen Familie die immer weiter steigenden geopolitischen Spannungen in der technologischen Aufrüstung zwischen China und den USA erlebt.
Nach einer kurzen Unterbrechung geht es gleich weiter. Bleiben Sie dran.
Deal ist nicht einfach nur eine Payroll-Plattform, sondern eine, die Ihr Team tatsächlich gut finden könnte. HR, IT und Payroll, endlich in einem. Intern entwickelt für mehr Sicherheit. Besuchen Sie deel.com/podcast.
Übrigens, wenn Sie künftig über alle Themen aus den Bereichen Digitalisierung, Tech, Wirtschaft und Politik auf dem Laufenden bleiben wollen und noch kein Handelsblatt-Abo haben, möchte ich Ihnen unser exklusives Spezial für Disrupt-Hörerinnen und Hörer ans Herz legen. Mit dem Aktionscode MATTES sparen Sie 40% auf Ihr H+ Premium Jahresabo. Sie haben damit Zugriff auf alle aktuellen Artikel im Web und in der App, sowie auf unser E-Paper und das Handelsblatt-Archiv. Mehr dazu unter handelsblatt.com/disrupt40 und in den Shownotes. Und damit wechseln wir ins Englische und kommen zu meinem Gespräch mit der Bestseller-Autorin und Technologie-Journalistin Karen Hao. Hey Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Karen, probably no other journalist has followed OpenAI as long and as closely as you have. Over the years, you did more than 150 interviews with current or former employees. Why is this story so important to you?
Yeah, I think ever since ChatGPT came out at the end of November 2022, AI has been a topic that no one can stop talking about because it is affecting so many aspects of people's lives, whether it's their kids' education or their healthcare access or just thinking about their possibility for future economic opportunity. And to understand how we got to the world that we exist in today with AI, you have to understand the story of OpenAI, because every aspect of what AI looks like and how it works today with ChatGPT and these large language models in particular can pretty much be traced back to some kind of decision that was made at that company.
Mm-hmm. In the AI world, the importance of OpenAI is obvious, but I mean, here's why I think everyone should care and why it really matters for decision makers. First, there's no other company and no other CEO that have put topics at the top of boardroom agendas around the globe. Secondly, OpenAI's CEO Sam Altman is asked for advice by presidents and shapes how nations think about infrastructure and education. And third, if the people in our audience have recently asked themselves, will my job still exist in a few years? Well, chances are OpenAI has something to do with that too. So Karen, here's my question for you. I think a single product alone, even if it's ChatGPT, can't explain that kind of power. If you had to put it into a formula, how exactly did OpenAI become so influential?
I think OpenAI definitely could not have become as influential as it did first, based on without the foundation that was laid beforehand by other tech companies in Silicon Valley. I think the decade before OpenAI came onto the scene, there were already plenty of things that companies were doing to create a cultural norm around the world that we should just be readily giving up our data to these organizations, installing the surveillance capitalism business model to turn our data into monetizable assets, and all of the infrastructure that the companies were building as well, all were kind of predecessors to what ultimately enabled OpenAI to do what it did. But then OpenAI took all of that data, that infrastructure, those cultural norms that were already established, and essentially accelerated it completely by multiple orders of magnitude. They poured all of that data, scraped it from the internet into their AI models. They used that infrastructure to train massive models that had never been seen before. And then they packaged that into products that people have just readily adopted because we have gotten used to free technology platforms that we use in exchange for our private data. So I think they essentially were able to take advantage of a lot of the things that had already been installed into our world previously and seamlessly integrate themselves into not just individuals' lives, but into industries and into the very fabric of how, even governments now operate.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk with you about OpenAI, about the AI race between the US and China, and also about what entrepreneurs here in Europe might learn from all this. But before we get to that, I'd love people to understand why I think we should listen to you. Today, you're one of the best-known technology reporters worldwide. You worked for MIT Technology Review, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and others. But at first, you wanted to build a career in tech yourself. What drew you into the industry?
I was really interested in how do you create social change, and I specifically was thinking about the challenge of the climate crisis and how do you mitigate the climate crisis. And it seemed to me that the best hope that we had for mitigating the climate crisis was large-scale social behavioral change, and I thought that technology could be the best tool for facilitating that. And so that was originally my draw to go work in the tech industry and to study mechanical engineering at MIT. But it quickly became clear to me after joining Silicon Valley that the system of incentives within Silicon Valley facilitate the production of profitable technologies, not necessarily technologies that actually are aligned with the public benefit. And by the time I entered the industry, it was actually increasingly clear that those profitable technologies were in fact antithetical to technologies for the public benefit.
Mm-hmm. You worked just 1 year as an application engineer at a startup that came out of Google's secret research lab, X. Still, that time really shaped you. How and why?
It made me realize that Silicon Valley is a very capitalistic place, and if you allow it to just continue operating based on the incentives of hyper supercharged capitalism, you are ultimately going to create technologies that actually undermine many of the things that we should deeply care to fortify, such as the foundations of democracy. And the best way to make sure that that happens is by doing things like raising awareness about issues, like engaging in collective action to push back against these companies, because those are all different levers and mechanisms by which the incentives then change. Like these are ways to pressure the companies to act not just based on what the most hyper-capitalistic thing to do is, but to also respond to public feedback and other types of governance mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. And today you combine two skills. You understand the language of tech and you can explain it in words everyone understands. From your perspective, what is often lost in translation between the techies and everyone else?
That's a good question. I think when I started writing about tech, the thing that I felt was the gap is that people don't realize the culture that exists within the tech industry or the way that technologists think about what they are ultimately doing. And so first of all, people in the public often don't even realize that technology is shaped by humans. Like when they're interacting with ChatGPT, they often don't even, or Google or Facebook. You know, I've talked with people who are like, "Wait, Google is a company?" There's still this sense that these technologies kind of fall from the skies sometimes, and they don't necessarily have values encoded in them that are specific to the people who built them. So I think that is something that I try to translate a lot, is like, who are these people that actually make the day-to-day decisions that then lead to a complete change in how we ultimately operate and go about our lives? And I also think that there is, for people who do realize that there are technologists behind the curtain, there's sometimes a misunderstanding about why they do what they do. I think many people believe that they're purely driven by the desire to make money or to make themselves rich, but there are more complex motivations that employees of these companies have. Many of them often believe that they are actually doing right by the world, that they're doing the best thing possible to change the world. And so I also try to translate back to them, you think that you might be serving society, but actually this is how your technology is falling apart. And I try to speak to that audience as much as I try to speak to the public, to hopefully influence how they go about making their decisions and maybe start adjusting in a way that ultimately does make these technologies more beneficial for the public.
Mm-hmm. And I think the mix of motives already leads us directly to OpenAI. I mean, this unique company that shakes up markets and already changes how many of us work today. You started reporting on it before it became world famous. How did you see and experience the company back then?
So I went to embed within the company for 3 days in 2019. And at that time, the organization was in a totally different place. They had started as a nonprofit in 2015, and by 2019 had just introduced a for-profit arm within the nonprofit that's now become the infamous structure that OpenAI grapples with. But I thought that the organization was very interesting because of the way that they portrayed themselves as a fundamentally different entity than the typical Silicon Valley company. And I thought, if they have successfully figured out how to create an organization that can innovate on technology in the public interest and still be able to access capital for being able to pay for the cost that it takes to develop the technology, but like exit out of this intense VC loop of just ultimately making technologies that give their investors a return on the investment, that we should actually be covering this as a crucial case study for understanding how to scale it up and make sure that, you know, we end up having more organizations like this that can build technologies for the public benefit. So that's how I initially perceived the organization, was if they are doing what they say that they're doing, this would be really, really groundbreaking. And what I realized quickly was that they weren't actually doing what they said they were.
Yeah, and people often say OpenAI has changed from a philanthropic organization into a fully commercial company. But I often ask myself, did the philosophy of the company and its people really change, or was it just the structure and just a tool for marketing and tax reasons?
It's a really great question. I think that I have concluded at this point that it was really just the structure that changed and not necessarily the philosophy, because from the very beginning, when Elon Musk and Sam Altman co-founded OpenAI, they were not doing it purely as a project of altruism or idealism. They specifically did it as a way to counter Google, because it did not sit well with them that Google would get to shape a technology that they saw to be profoundly consequential instead of them. And so there was already this egotistical element to that was driving OpenAI, and OpenAI ultimately restructured itself as an extension of that desire to be the one that dominated this technology, that shaped this technology. And so you could say that they have actually been relatively consistent in that core idea of being the number one player in this space, wanting to be the number one player in this space, wanting to make AI in their own image, and just changing their tactics over time for how to actually get there.
Talking about the number one, OpenAI is now going after $500 billion valuation and is about to become the most valuable startup ever. From your perspective, should it be?
I think there's something deeply wrong with our economic system if there is allowed to be private companies that are valued at that much, while there are so many people around the world that also live in such poverty. Like, there's just something deeply wrong about that degree of inequality that has been enabled in the system that we live in today. And especially it feels deeply problematic that this has been allowed to happen for a company that has no effective business model. What actually justifies this valuation is very unclear, both from a financial perspective and in terms of the more squishy definition of value that its technologies are providing. The promises that OpenAI has made about what its technologies will bring us have not really come to pass. They've talked about how AI can lead to huge gains in productivity, a 10% boost in GDP in all countries. You know, that's not come to pass. So why is this company going to soon be valued at $500 billion? It's really not clear.
And I mean, behind that valuation is the hope that OpenAI will become the next Google or Apple. How do you see the chances of that, and what do you think could most likely stop the company? Is it that there's no clear path to the business model?
I think so. I think, you know, there was just a report that came out from a U.S. government agency, I think last week, that found that the adoption rate for generative AI at Fortune 500 companies has declined because these companies are struggling to find actual value to justify the price of the subscription for these services. And we are seeing a lot of these AI companies, not just OpenAI, but many of the companies engaged in creating large-scale generative AI models, pushing for adoption by just forcing users to pay for additional AI features, even when no one asked for it. You know, like I use Google Workspace for my work, and I was just informed that I now need to pay a higher subscription for Google Workspace because of the quote value, amazing value that I'm somehow receiving from the AI tools that I never use and didn't want in the first place. And so that in and of itself is showing you that there's just a very, very shaky business model, very shaky value proposition. These companies are struggling to find product market fit, which is very different from, how the tech companies, the older generation of tech companies originally came to develop their valuations. They originally did provide products that had a very good product market fit and did provide significant value to people, which is why adoption continued to increase and people were willing to pay for those services.
Mm-hmm. The huge valuation would probably not exist without the dream of AGI. So super intelligence, almost all-knowing and smarter than the greatest Nobel Prize winners. First, from a technical point of view, do you think that's even possible to get there?
I think putting a technical analysis aside, the main problem with artificial general intelligence is that there's no definition of what that actually is. So you can't really say whether you've gotten there or not when you don't even know how to define the milestone. And this has been a longstanding problem within AI in general, because AI, since the very beginning, when it was first established as a research field in 1956, has pegged its goals to this idea of recreating human-level intelligence in machines, but there's no scientific consensus around what human intelligence is, and we don't know how to measure human intelligence or to really describe, articulate in a precise way what constitutes human intelligence. So, OpenAI, as evidenced by OpenAI, has changed its definition of AGI many different times, or it'll use a different definition for different contexts. Like it defines it on its website as highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. So it defines it as a labor automating technology. And maybe you could say we've actually already gotten there in some senses because it's already having that kind of pressure on the market, and we are already seeing significant job loss due to the executives starting to believe in the promise of replacing workers with this technology. But OpenAI has also used the definition of AGI being an AI system that generates $100 billion in profits, and that was what it cited in its deal with Microsoft, as reported by The Information. So have we reached that yet? Probably not, but would we get there soon? Maybe. But is that actually a useful definition of AGI for the rest of the world? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I wonder if people had a better understanding of how AI actually works and what it is, would it still be possible to create such a hype around artificial intelligence?
I don't think so. I do think that AI literacy is a very important antidote to hype. And what I often say to people to understand about the capabilities of these technologies is that right now, pretty much all of the cutting edge AI systems that we see are based on this probabilistic engine where you're pouring in all of this data indiscriminately scraped from the internet to try and tease out different patterns about how we speak, how we create things, how we exchange dialogue. And then those patterns are used to generate things that kind of have a semblance of what we've created in the past. And if you think about that core capability and then project out, what would that core capability actually be useful for, you would realize that there is a subset of things that core capability can actually, be helpful with, but it's not the full range of all possible things that these companies are saying or promising us to justify the valuations. They cannot create new medicines. You cannot use these models that are scraped on internet data to create high quality drugs somehow that cure cancer. That's just not how that would work. And so, yeah, I do. One of the goals of my book was kind of this dimension of AI literacy, hoping people could understand a little bit more on the mechanics of how these technologies work so that they can understand that the ways that they're being sold to us are, in fact, a bit misleading.
Yeah, I think he had a very good and important point. So would such an AGI, artificial general intelligence, even make sense? I mean, for what problems and challenges do we really need to squeeze the abilities of geniuses like Albert Einstein in physics, John Maynard Keynes in economics, and Shakespeare in literature into one model, into one chatbot?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've become very critical about the AI industry writ large about is the fact that there is sort of this sense that they're just advancing technology for technology's sake rather than building technologies in service of actually overcoming specific challenges that people face. And when you put aside technology or AI and just think about what do we actually need as a society, or like what do we need as humans to improve our quality of life, people need access to clean air, access to clean water, better education, better healthcare. Like these are the fundamental building blocks of a dignified life and access to solid economic opportunity. And when you look at all of those different things, the development of these large-scale AI models that are supposed to get us to some kind of everything machine is actually actively undermining all of those things right now. Whereas the types of AI technologies that could fortify those things are just not being invested in. But we actually have the available techniques to create small task-specific AI models that tackle computational challenges along the quest to each of these different things that we want. And it just seems to me kind of like a no-brainer that we should, as a society, it seems like a no-brainer that we should, as a society, actually be reallocating all of the energy and capital towards this, ultimately what I call an imperial project of artificial general intelligence construction towards much more sensible AI technologies that can actually bring us the benefits that we want.
Yeah, I've often asked myself, is AGI really necessary, or is it more about the obsession of billionaires who hope that by creating a human-like intelligence, they can gain godlike power?
I think it's absolutely. There's an element of a desire to control the last thing that cannot be controlled, which is, or maybe to understand the last thing that can't be understood. I don't know. And it's funny because I've also heard people, theorize, and this has been like an aspect of feminist scholarship as well, is there's something to be said about the fact that all of the people who are obsessed with building AGI are also men, and they do not have the capability like women to bear children. And there's been speculation in the same way that there was actually this paper that I was reading. This is a little bit of a tangent, but there was this paper that I was reading from a feminist scholar about the obsession of men to build nuclear weapons. And at the time, she pointed out, through her scholarly research, that they would use the language of creation to talk about their weapons. Like they would talk about birthing these weapons and the energy and power of these nuclear warheads. And there's just remarkable parallels with the way that men now talk about birthing these AI technologies and competing with one another to create intelligences. And yeah, that's just like...
But it is an interesting point, so I think I need to read this paper too. Your book is called Empires of AI, and it's not only about OpenAI, it's very much about power and influence. How did you come up with the title, and what do you mean by these empires of AI?
Yeah, so I wanted to help people understand that these companies are not just businesses that are dominating a market with their products and services, but they are entities that have consolidated a profound amount of political and economic power, to the point that there's basically no nation-state government that is more powerful than these companies anymore. And what is that but empire. But the other aspect of this analogy that is helpful is to help people understand how these companies actually operate in the world. The way they go about consolidating their political and economic power is remarkably identical to the way that empires of old did that as well. So I point to multiple different parallels in the book, the first of which is that they lay claim to resources that are not their own. Second, they exploit an extraordinary amount of labor. They contract, thousands and thousands of workers in the global south that they pay very, very little money, and that labor ultimately fortifies the empire. But they don't actually have to provide the value that labor actually gave them. Mm-hmm. The third feature is that they monopolize knowledge production. So they have hired up most of the AI researchers in the world to work for them. And they are not, these AI researchers are not actually able to produce science that shows legitimately what the limitations and capabilities of these AI models are anymore. They only produce papers that are in alignment with what the AI companies want the public narrative to be about their technologies. And the fourth and final feature that I talk about is that empires always engage in an existential arms race narrative where there are evil empires in the world and good empires in the world. And they, as the good empire, are on a civilizing mission to bring progress and modernity to the rest of humanity, which justifies why they need such an extraordinary amount of resources and labor. And the evil empires, if the evil empires got there first, would actually bring devastation to humanity.
Mm-hmm. What's notable here is how political and economic power are growing together. OpenAI and its competitor Anthropic also frame their importance in political terms. Their leaders say America must build a superintelligence before China does. Would these massive investments even be possible without the economic war between the US and China?
That's a really interesting question. I think if there were not... So I guess there's two parts of the question. One is whether or not the economic war with China and this rhetoric is actually enabling the companies to engage in this level of investment. And I think that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. The companies are using this US-China arms race rhetoric to enable the continued consolidation of more and more economic resources and thereby more and more political influence. I think if there were not a economic war between the US and China, they would find something else to play that role. So I guess the second part of your question, which is like, if we didn't have this, would they lose their justification? No, they would just find another one.
Interesting. Yeah, just a lot of it feels like the old space race between the US and Russia. Only this time the money doesn't go into state companies and research, but into private ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a huge part of the game of these companies is to continuously reallocate capital away from the state to themselves as private entities.
Yeah. You once said it's an illusion to think only Chinese AI would be autocratic, that OpenAI is too. So what do you mean by that?
So OpenAI always says, and all of the US companies always say, because we are American companies, we are building democratic AI. And there's absolutely nothing democratic about the way that they build AI. It is extremely autocratic. I mean, they do not ever consult anyone about any of the decisions along the path to their AI development or deployment. They do not ask people what kind of data they use. They do not ask people the size of the supercomputers they're building to train these models and the amount of energy that they're using. They do not, ask just the fact that they're like now forcing the adoption of the tools by just forcing everyone to pay more expensive subscriptions for everything that you've already previously used, but now with AI, none of that is democratic. They are essentially engaging in the same model of we decide things and you deal with it.
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, you were born and raised in the US, but your family has a Chinese background and you call Hong Kong your home at the time. You speak Mandarin. Do the rising tensions between the US and China have a personal meaning for you? How do you experience them?
Yeah, they absolutely have a personal meaning because I would not exist if there were not at one point cooperation between US and China. My parents were able to move from China to the US and give birth to me and give me all the opportunities and everything that I had because of that relationship between the two countries. And so to me, I have always, because of my Chinese American identity, I have always been, a pacifist. I've always thought that we don't exist in a zero-sum world where there's just great power competition and like people cannot cooperate. Like the greatest challenges that we face as a human species are ones that require cooperation globally. And the fact that we now engage in this kind of rhetoric of U.S.-China competition, like civilizational conflict, I think is shooting ourselves as a species in the foot because the clock is ticking on things like climate change. Mm-hmm. And we need the two largest economies in the world to be cooperating on those types of existential issues.
Mm-hmm. And more broadly in the US, if someone with a Chinese name wants to work at a tech company today, do you see restrictions or mistrust? Or is it just in the media?
There's definitely not restrictions because, 40% of the tech industry probably is of Asian origin, maybe more. I mean, this is a ballpark number, but I mean, like Meta, for example, their super intelligence team is majority Chinese American right now. And so I think, like people say all the time, the two largest producers of tech talent in the world are the US and China. And there are plenty of Chinese researchers, Chinese American researchers, and engineers that make huge contributions to the industry in the US. So I think companies could not just bar like the 50% of the pool of talent.
Sure.
So we haven't actually seen that. But certainly there are smaller companies, there are smaller startups that take, like defense contractors or things like that might take a very xenophobic stance and then have more discrimination against people with Chinese ethnicity. But it is, it's not at all the mainstream.
Nach einer kurzen Unterbrechung geht es gleich weiter. Bleiben Sie dran.
Überkommt auch Sie diese Nostalgie, wenn Sie an Marken aus Ihrer Kindheit denken? Sie sind irgendwie Teil unseres Lebens geworden und stehen für große Ideen, Pioniere und Durchbrüche. Doch nicht immer war in der Geschichte dieser Ikonen alles so harmonisch. Es gab Streit, Fehler, Pleiten und Familiendramen. In der neuen Staffel Vivo History, Marken und Mythen schauen wir hinter die Kulissen. Ab 10. Mai, jeden zweiten Samstag.
You've also reported or are reporting about China as a journalist and about AI in China. After the success of the Chinese AI company DeepSeek earlier this year, there was a big debate in the US and in Europe. How strong do you think China's AI industry really is in comparison to the US American, and what are its strengths and weaknesses?
I think the Chinese AI industry is very strong, and part of it is because one of the key ingredients of what makes a strong AI industry is talented researchers and engineers. And whereas in the past, most of the talent in China would desire to go to the US and would then have the opportunity to do that, and would it end up contributing to the American tech industry due to many different factors, including the pandemic, including, the a lot more opportunities being available in China, and including the xenophobic rhetoric of the US. There's been an increasing share of talented people that want to stay home in China and contribute to the Chinese tech industry. So there's been an up-leveling of talent in the AI industry in China that has then led to, really, really exciting work being done, both in terms of research breakthroughs as well as the development of different applications. And DeepSeek is very much an example of that, where the US government has tried very hard to hold back the Chinese AI industry by restricting China from access to American-designed chips using export controls. And that would be an effective strategy if you did not have a really dense talent pool that can be creative and think and get around these kinds of restrictions. But because they do, they ended up just innovating around the issue, and DeepSeek happened. So, but that said, I think the US AI industry is still considered on both sides of the aisle by both American and Chinese researchers and engineers as still ahead. There are a lot more AI companies in the US and a higher density of top-tier opportunities to do work at the cutting edge. Whereas in China, DeepSeek is seen as still a little bit of an anomaly in that they were able to create such a talent-dense team and work on these really interesting creative breakthroughs. So in terms of comparing the two, the US is still, more mature in its developmental stage.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to the question of economic and political powers growing together, there's one passage in your book that really struck me. I mean, there are several, but this one struck me. In a 2019 memo, years before ChatGPT, Sam Altman told employees the world should think OpenAI is winning at something. That way, key influencers would help, and even presidents would turn to OpenAI for answers on big decisions. We know this actually came true. Last year on his world tour, Altman was welcomed by heads of state almost like a messiah. Does that scare you?
It doesn't scare me so much as just frustrate me and make me work harder at reporting on this company and, work harder at making sure that the public and policymakers get access to high quality information.
Yeah, never in history have entrepreneurs been as powerful as they are today. I mean, in Europe, we felt this in a shocking way when Elon Musk, the boss of Tesla, SpaceX, and the Starlink satellite network suddenly had the power to decide where Ukraine could defend itself against the Russian invasion. And it's no secret that powerful tech entrepreneurs in the US want to move beyond democracy. You also mentioned that. What kind of world order are they aiming for?
An autocratic one where they are the ones that control everything. There's this sort of phrase that has become slowly more popular over time, this idea of a politics of exit, where democracy no longer works in terms of as the best way to organize society, and we should just exit that model towards one of a series of companies that are networked with one another and with CEOs at the top. And that is essentially, they are saying, an anti-democratic society where they rule everything.
And how likely is that scenario? How can we prevent it?
How likely? I guess for me, the better question is the second one. Like, I don't really know that it's actually worthwhile to predict the likelihood of something when we can actually just change it. And to me, the way to change it is to continue fighting for democracy and democratic institutions. We need to first contain the power of these companies, these tech companies, that these empires of AI, because pretty much every large tech company is now an AI company. And the best way to contain that in a moment right now when we're not actually seeing leadership from governments is to focus on bottoms-up governance. So when you think about the full supply chain of AI development, these companies actually need access to an extraordinary amount of resources in order to do what they do. They need our data, they need land, they need energy, they need water, they need labor, they need talent, and then they need access to all of these different markets to actually turn their businesses into something financially viable that can sustain itself, including schools, hospitals, offices, government agencies, and all of these resources and all of these spaces. They actually require our cooperation, the public's cooperation, to get access to them. And thus far, we've been quite complacent in actually just giving that cooperation without asking for anything in return. Because as we sort of talked about in the beginning, Silicon Valley has been very successful in installing a culture over the last decade of making us complacent, of making us think that it's totally normal that all the things that we own, they act as if they own. And we need to restore our sense of real ownership over these things. And so we were already seeing movements of collective action around the world to do that. We are seeing artists and writers that are suing these companies saying, actually, that intellectual property is ours. We own it, and you can't just take it without credit or compensation. You have to give us something in return. And we're seeing, we're seeing artists also glaze their artwork such that if a company takes it and trains their AI models on it, it breaks the AI model down. That's sort of a form of resistance of reclaiming ownership over that particular resource. We're seeing hundreds of communities protest data center developments and actually preventing data centers from entering their communities when it is not offered to that community with full transparency about how much energy and water that facility is going to use, and without any kinds of checks on how it's going to operate and how it's going to continue consuming resources. And all of these things are what I see as sites or forms of democratic contestation where people are remembering that they can actually just assert their ownership over these key resources and these key spaces. And if everyone did that and stopped cooperating with these companies on the things that the companies actually need for their own survival, then the companies have to respond and change their ways. And it's not about ultimately getting the companies to not exist. It's about breaking the cycle of their imperial behaviors. And the key feature of the imperial dimension of their behaviors is that they do whatever they want without any consequence. And the power balance is such that they can just seize whatever, and the others, like we, don't get anything in return. But if we actually push back and retain ownership and control over the things that they actually need, they will have to start striking mutually beneficial engagements. They will have to pay people for the data. They will have to be transparent about where their data centers are actually going and maybe provide economic opportunity to communities that are hosting those data centers. They will actually have to respond to the way that teachers and students actually want AI to be introduced into the classroom. And once we have that kind of mutual exchange, that's when we start going from empire to democracy. And I think that is going to be the key to making sure that these companies don't ultimately completely overtake our politics and move us out of democracy.
There's this saying, the US innovates, China scales, and Europe regulates. For many listeners here, that's hard to swallow. They feel their companies are being slowed down, and founders say regulation like the EU AI Act pushed them abroad. So if I understand you right, you argue for more regulation. How could it look like so that startups and companies still can be innovative and compete on a global level?
Yeah, I think more regulation, but definitely the right kind of regulation. I do think that there is an argument to be made that the EU has maybe implemented certain regulations that have mired smaller companies in too much bureaucracy, which makes the startup cost, the initial hurdle to begin innovating really, really challenging. Whereas I do think the EU has also done a far better job than the US at regulating large companies. And so I would advocate for kind of a more balanced approach of making sure that there are resources and not too much red tape for entrepreneurs to begin their endeavors, but then that there should be continued like more accountability mechanisms on like the really, really large players. I also think in general, like the most important thing that we need in terms of regulating the AI industry is transparency. We just have absolutely no understanding of what are the ingredients they're actually using to develop their models. And I mean ingredients very broadly defined. The data that they're putting into these things, the amount of energy that they're actually using to train their models. Like all of the numbers that we have on the energy consumption or energy impact of these models is actually based on estimates, like well-informed estimates, but not actually direct measurements from these companies. They also do not say when, which vendors they contract with for the workers that work for them, or which other application companies they contract with to supply their models for use in industries like healthcare or education or finance. So there's just so many layers of opacity, and that is part of what really creates an inability for the democratic process to work, because people don't even know half the time, like, what are they even contesting or protesting or holding accountable? And so that step number one would just be to elevate the amount of information that the public actually has access to for understanding the full supply chain of these technologies.
And with regard to energy efficiency, there's a lot of research to do still. So do you think Europe can still play a role that the US and China would actually take notice of? Is it in that part of the game? Or what should our business leaders focus on from your perspective?
Building technology, building alternatives to the Silicon Valley approach to AI development. I do not think that it is in Europe's best interest or the world's best interest for European business leaders to be somehow obsessed with replicating what Silicon Valley has done. I mean, Silicon Valley alone is already doing extraordinary damage to the planet. We do not need a Silicon Valley 2.0 to do the same thing at the same time. But we certainly need a lot more alternatives to the colossal large-scale approach to developing everything machines, and to have more types of AI technologies that are small, task-specific, that are tackling the types of challenges that we talked about earlier that we really, really need. When I talk with people all the time about the cost of something like ChatGPT, like one of the first questions that will usually come up is, what should I use instead? And I wish that I could point to a whole range of other alternatives, like, oh, you can use these. And unfortunately, we don't have that yet. And European business leaders can absolutely step up to fill that void. And the EU, the government, can also invest a lot more in public AI research that actually provides independent validation, independent sources of knowledge for what the true limitations and capabilities of these models are beyond what the companies tell us.
Yeah, I think that's very encouraging. Karen, we're coming to the end of our show, but I have one last point. I first heard about your book a month ago when Sam Altman posted on X that there would soon be a few books about OpenAI and that they wouldn't get everything right, especially if journalists put their own twist on it. Why do you think he doesn't want us to read it? Your book especially.
It doesn't align with what OpenAI ultimately wants, which is to continue having unfettered access to resources, to labor, to everything, such that they can continue to expand their empire.
I think it's actually a recommendation to read it, and our listeners can make up their own minds about everything else. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Und damit sind wir auch schon wieder am Ende von Handelsblatt Disrupt. Wie immer freuen wir uns über Kommentare in der Handelsblatt Disrupt LinkedIn-Gruppe. Sie können mir aber auch eine E-Mail schicken. Die Details finden Sie in den Shownotes. Danke an dieser Stelle auch für die Unterstützung von meinen Handelsblatt-Kollegen Fabian Livret und Jan Lutz sowie von Migo Fecke vom Professional Podcast. Wir freuen uns, wenn Sie nächste Woche wieder reinhören. Bis dahin wünsche ich Ihnen eine gute und informative Zeit. Ihre Larissa Holzki.
KI oder KO? Das ist keine Schlagzeile, das ist die Zukunftsfrage für Ihr Business. Die technologische Revolution ist längst da. Jetzt kommt der Realitätstest. Beim Handelsblatt KI Summit 2025 am 12. und 13. November zeigen wir, wie Unternehmen heute die Weichen für morgen stellen. Mit Mut zur Veränderung, mit klarer Haltung und mit Praxiserfahrung. Sparen Sie 15% mit dem Code KI-Summit15 und melden Sie sich an unter handelsblatt-ki.de.